The legal basis to generate lawsuits based on health losses and damages. I would start with a little overview about the framework for climate neutrality as a goal for states, and then move on to the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice stating the responsibility of states with regard to climate damages. Then we turned to private law, to lawsuits based on tort law, and I will show you some cornerstones of the responsibility of carbon majors with two judgments which are highly discussed. First, the Shell judgment of the Court of Appeal of The Hague in the Netherlands of 2024, and then the RWE judgment, very recent, of the OLG in Germany 2025. Starting with the climate neutrality as a goal for states. Well, it started in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, 1992, with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Here, greenhouse gases were identified as dangerous for the environment and for climate. That's why states had the obligation to combat such emissions. However, it took until to the Paris Agreement in 2015 until there were concrete temperature limits and best efforts obligations of the states to hinder temperature increases above 2 degrees Celsius or even better 1.5 degrees Celsius. This Paris Agreement was transformed into binding force for the European Union by the European Climate Change Act, a regulation from 2021, and it states prominently the goal of climate neutrality in its Article 2. That means that the European Union and all its member states, including Germany, has to be climate neutral at the latest by 2050. This is the framework, and now let's have a look at the ruling of the International Court of Justice. It was an advisory opinion. It was initiated by the United Nations resolution, and the International Court of Justice in The Hague rendered this advisory opinion under public international law in July 2025. There were far-reaching observations under public international law. The first one is that the right to a clean environment is a human right, and that all states are obliged to take measures to achieve the 1.5 degree target and to cooperate to this end. And industrialized states must provide financial support to developing states for climate protection and adaptation measures. And if they fail to do so, they may be obliged to provide compensation under certain circumstances. This is a far-reaching judgment under public international law obliging the states. However, we have also judgments based on private law, based on tort law, which addresses the responsibility of carbon majors. And the first judgment of this kind was the Shell judgment in the Netherlands from the Hague District Court in 2021, and then from the Court of Appeal in 2024. And the District Court ruled that the Shell company would have to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030, which is a huge step for a fossil fuel company. However, this judgment was overruled by the Court of Appeal in The Hague. The Court of Appeal said it was not possible to to determine in a so concrete way the amount of reduction of CO2 emissions. However, the general responsibility of states were upheld, of big companies were upheld, so that there is this general responsibility for companies to reduce CO2 emissions. And in a similar way is the judgment of the OLGHAM, very recent, of 2025. It was initiated by Saul Julia, a Peruvian farmer. You probably know this case. It is because of the melting of the glacier. And the Court of Appeal in Hamm ruled that it was already foreseeable in the mid-1960s that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions would lead to global warming. That's a very far-reaching statement. And that it wouldn't be a political question. That means that courts can indeed judge on the liability of companies. Big carbon majors are responsible for at least for their scope 1 emissions, meaning that also the emissions of the subsidiaries are attributed to the company, and especially that operating permits and approval by German authorities would not hinder responsibility under private law. However, the claim was dismissed, and RWE, the carbon major of Germany, won the case because the claimant couldn't determine or couldn't show that his property was at high risk. It was only a minor risk of flooding from this glacier lake. That's why the claim was dismissed. The open question now are what is, and that's the interesting thing for us, what is with the violation of the right to health and the causality in sudden onset events. I think it would be important to show that global warming has an impact on climate health and that you can also establish the causality. Otherwise, it would be difficult to held private carbon majors liable for the global warming, but on the other way around, and that's why it's important that NGOs and science work together in the attribution sciences. If you can show that, I see a certain responsibility of carbon majors to contribute to the mitigation of CO2 emissions and also to contribute to a damage fund, for example, to finance damages out of global warming. Thank you very much for having me here, and I wish you all the best for the further deliberations in Belém. Thank you.